Thank you all for being here, and we'll start. As always, when we talk about collecting, it's very interesting to start from the beginning, literally. So I want to ask each of our panelists to say a few words about how you started collecting, but in particular, not the mechanics, but why. Why did you sort of start this journey that basically has, started quite some time ago, and it has a very long sort of lifespan. And of course, I also want you to comment on, when did you, if ever, when did you consider yourself a collector rather than just, I would like to buy 3 paintings to hang in my hall? Maybe we start with Kito.
We came to, Jane and our 3 children came to India in about 1993, and we really knew nothing at all. But we were overwhelmed by one of the greatest cultures on the planet. I mean, if you look at 5,000, 8,000 years of history, of basically only China, possibly Persia, can even be held in that same category. And it wasn't just paintings, it was everything. It was music, it was dance, it was incredible historic sites. Wherever you went, you were overwhelmed by this extraordinary culture. And we just try to work out how to sort of decode it and actually engage with it. And we've ended up building a collection of paintings because we can. Pin's here, she does dancing. You can't collect dancing, you can experience it. So a lot of the culture that's there is ephemeral culture, and it just happens to be that with things like art and sculpture, you can actually buy it. We found that art is an extraordinary bridge into a culture. If you start to get involved with it, you start to decode the culture that you're in and you begin to access it. And if you think about India in the 20th century, it was an extraordinary century. It started with colonialism and went through independence, and now is one of the great economies in the world. And art reflects that. And if you start to collect and you understand what the collectors, what the painters were trying to do, or the artists were trying to do, you then begin to understand what was happening in that society.
So for you, as a person coming into the culture from outside, the art and the collecting of art became also a way to decode and sort of, have a kind of articulate a kind of response to this new culture that you had been in. But why did you decide to collect? I mean, did you collect traditional material, or you already had made the decision when you started to start with the modern material, and why that?
We're completely accidental collectors. We came into India and we would see paintings or sculpture, and we'd never heard of Hussein. We didn't know a Hussein from a Gaitonde, from a Sousa, and all you could do was respond to what you saw. And in trying to understand that better, you then would end up speaking to people, because you'd always have to seek help. You'd have to have other people get you to understand it. Same with dance and with music. It's just quite alien. And in the process of doing that, you begin also to discover great people, people who are in parallel to the other lives we were leading.
Excellent. Now we'll move on to the other 3 panelists. So you're of Indian origin, so your relationship to Indian art is slightly different, even if physically, even though you're living in America. So Kent, and Kent, we are of course showing the M.F. Hussein Lightning work, the 1975 work, next week on Tuesday. So I'd like to ask Ken, how did you start with this? What made you and why?
First of all, thank you very much, Boon, for having me and the Asian Society. Very early on, when I need to look back and tell you a story. I was involved in a project, in a technical project. I was working with George Harris, who was married to Anne Rockefeller. So he gave me the introduction to the European works of art, into Picasso's and Chagall's and other works. And I was so much mesmerized by his collection and the way they kept the art for the next generation. I was inspired by that, so I wanted to also collect art similar to them. So I started looking at various museums and visiting some of the museums in New York City, and I could not find Indian contemporary art, Indian moderns in any museums.
When was this?
This is early 90s.
Okay.
So all I can see was, one or two miniatures and mostly antiquities. And I really wanted to break away from that to see real Indian contemporary art. I could not find it. That actually led me to start the miniature collection first, because that's how I got introduced as an Indian art. And then we moved on to the Indian contemporary art from that point.
And Sunil, your collection, I mean, you collect both classical material as well as modern and contemporary material. I mean, what started first, or everything took off at the same time?
Yeah, unfortunately not. So look, I mean, I was born in Baroda,
Yes.
so which is
One of the
important centers of art, and my father used to collect stamps, and so he would explain to me the stories behind the stamps, and so to go in that time period, growing up in India, we were not thinking about art. We were more interested in just food and housing and things like that. So that appreciation came much later in life, and I think a lot of those same stories resonate really well in the antiquities, which really appeals to me, because as Kito said, it's through art you can see what the culture and heritage is about, and that is, you gain an understanding of what's happening. So that's really how I approached it. But I think it, I don't discriminate. It has to be this, that, or the other. It has to be beautiful. It has to be, aesthetically appealing, and it needs to fit into some kind of a story that makes sense.
Okay. Now, I'll move on to Dipti before we come back to this issue of aesthetics, which I think the first three speakers are already beginning to tease.
So I think I became an accidental collector, a little bit like Kito. I think that seems to be a common journey for many of us. I think I have become a collector because I cannot help it.
Are you an addict?
I cannot help it, yeah. So I did grow up seeing art. My parents, made us do that, and very thankful for that. But my relationship with contemporary Indian art really grew when I was at IIT Kanpur. For those of you who know Kanpur and who know me also would realize that this was not a symbiotic relationship. So I would actually escape from Kanpur and go hang out in Lucknow from time to time at the Lalit Kala Academy. They had a very sort of a primitive residency at the time, and hang out with these artists, and they were as poor as I was. So they'd, cut me great deals on small works of art, and that's how, they started collecting a little bit. And then we fast forward a few years past then, and, life had changed a little bit, and I was starting to explore art more seriously. And I was sitting in the gallery, a gallery in Calcutta called Chitrakoot, run by Prakash Kejriwal. And Prakash just got this little painting and put it in front. And I really saw my blood pressure started going up. I just had such a visceral reaction to it. Many of you will know that painting. It's Ganesh Pine's Blue Boat. Yes. It's a sublime work. And somehow that changed me. It just changed me. And I was like, you know what? I need to have this element in my life. I guess I understood I'd become a collector some 2 or 3 years later, when we had a curator visit and then started berating me for art under the bed, art in the closet, art in the garage. Said, have you heard of off-site storage? And
I would say that's not too uncommon. I've had to fish art out of bathrooms before, and in the Philippines, some people have no walls, so they mount the art onto the ceiling.
Oh, wow.
So they could lie on the floor and look at. So there was an old collector who had these old masters that you had that. But the passion for that is very strong. So I want to pick up this thing about addiction and compulsion. What can and I'm going to open it up to the panel. Can you say a little bit about why do you feel? I mean, what happened? Was there any sort of something that happened or kind of journey that you went through that suddenly, after the first few, you just kept going on, over the next 10 years, more than 10 years? What exactly is this? What is the satisfaction that you get out of it that keeps you going like that? Because a lot of young collectors always ask that. They always ask that, what is it? What is this thing, that is called the collecting bug?
So, I mean, for us, I think to begin with, we had management consultants, unfortunately. And so everything has to fit into some sort of logical framework, or at least for me, for Jane, it's different. But when we first set off, we had empty walls in a new culture. So we had a good, strong, rational reason to go off and buy paintings and stick them up on the wall. And if they were local paintings, that was just fine. So at least we had our mental, we could tick that box, and it seemed quite reasonable. And our addiction was Ganesh Pine, Woman Before the Pillar, where we were mesmerized, and that was the beginning of our addictions, the first work we bought. And all of that was good until one day Jane came back and she'd seen these works by somebody called Bruta. And again, we hadn't heard of Bruta, but they were very, very big and they were black. Rameshwar Bruta. And there was just absolutely nowhere they were much too big to fit on any of our walls. She said, you've got to come and look at them, they're fantastic. So we went and looked at them. And these works, it was impossible for them ever to be on any wall. And that was when I think we recognized we'd moved beyond just being decorators to being addicts, because there was no rational reason for doing this. And we were compelled to buy them because we thought they were extraordinary works, and we continue to believe that they're extraordinary works. And sometimes when a work has that energy and it resonates with you, then it is, I think, very hard to resist that. And then you go through the process of not only is art a way for you to discover the culture that you're in, art then becomes a way for you to begin to understand who on earth you are, because you step back after a decade and you see you've got, it's a bit like a pointless painting, you've got 500, 600 things that you've bought, each were bought in isolation. You then put them out and you look at it and say, my goodness, why did we do this? Or what are the patterns of personality that have gone into this? Why have we collected lots of this and not of that? And so it becomes an exploration both of the culture that you're in, but also who you are. And
that's a really interesting point, because a lot of people, of course, we always hear the note that you become a collector when you run out of walls. That means you're collecting for more than just, in a sense, decorating your walls. There must be some other reason. And of course, a collection, also a lot of young collectors ask, what is a good collection? Is it a collection of famous names? Is it a collection of very expensive art? But, a lot of times, curators, we talk and we are always, oh God, let's not talk about money. But we say, a good collection is one where when you look at the collection, as you say, if you lay it out, you can get a sense of the personality of the person that, or persons that assemble that thing, these sort of work of arts. So Ken, of course, we can't get over the fact that next week we'll have a 60 feet mural. Obviously, no wall is going to, unless you're going to build a vault or you're going to build an art gallery, which some collectors have done. I mean, it's not that sort of far-fetched. So what is it that make you, I want to talk about collecting art that you cannot actually physically display or physically enjoy, so to speak, because they are...
I think it's very complex for me as a collector, because there's several factors inside your body and mind, the way you work in buying art. For me, I'm just a caretaker of the work. You never really own a work, right? You're just a caretaker of the work for the time being until the next generation. So it's all about making sure that the work is moving from a generation to generation. So if you looked at some of our works in our collection, whether it's Hussein or any of the other works, the first work, I think one of the first few works, they all happened to be in the progressive. It's not that we looked for the progressive, but my wife decided to put the hand up and start buying works without even knowing who the artists were, right? And for me, at the time, this was, if we're talking late 90s, early 2000s, and paintings were, tens of thousands versus what's going on in today's prices. So they were much more easier to collect. And also, even if you make a mistake, it's okay. It's not, it's an acceptable, forgivable mistake. Yeah. So when you ask me about the lighting, there's actually a lot went on in the way, we approached on the way I went pick up the painting, right? So I did not know the historical value of the painting when I bought it. I bought it because it was, number one, the biggest work, and number two, horses, which we happen to love anything with horses. So things like this, these are fundamentally the catalyst behind why we bought that particular work or any other work for that matter. And why that particular work? I think it's just a chemical reaction in my body wanted to have it.
Yeah. But also something that elements of it have a kind of affinity to you.
There's a lot of affinity in that work. I mean, I see from the painting, you have a lot of the industrialization of India in it. Yeah. I mean, you have the farming, you have the family planning symbol, which is very well known in India, if you really grew up in early 70s in India. So these are all the symbols that I'm familiar with, and I wanted to have it. So that's the story behind the painting.
Sunil, now why do you continue to be fascinated, for example, with Indian material, with both classical material and modern material?
Well, look, I mean, I think on the classical antiquities, growing up in India, we would call them idols, and they used to, I'm sure people in this audience would remember, they used to be on calendars.
Yes.
So, we never had the concept that it was art, right? And so I think, after coming here, after seeing them at the Met and Asia Society, which has some of the most amazing, priceless Indian antiquities, there's a whole history and culture that's surrounding it. So it really, you've been to my library. Most of my library is about, Indian antiquities and art. So it really opens it up. It opens your mind up, and and especially I'm from Sindh, which was right on the Silk Road, so very partial to Gandharan works, to Chola bronzes. So that's really what I have a reaction as well. So before I go to bed, there's like a couple of pieces that I pay darshan to before going, like the Nataraj symbol, or Gandharan Buddha, or Parvati, or Shiva. They just have a reaction for me, and I agree with Kent. We're custodians, because especially with the antiquities, they're that they are meant to be, like you're having a conversation with someone that lived 1,000 years ago, and hopefully they'll survive for another 1,000 years.
So Dipti, I want to pick up on what you said when you talked about that Ganesh Pine work. Is that this kind of visceral reaction to a work, is that like an important criteria for you? Did you ever have that feeling again?
Sure. Now, that particular work was, we've all experienced this, right? NFS, not for sale, which basically means it's not for sale to you, but, maybe if Kito comes along, it is for sale. But yes, I have responded viscerally to other works as well. But I think the nature of collecting does change a little bit, right? When you have multiple hundred works or something in a collection, not everything is going to be Ganesh Pine's Blue Boat. In fact, most things will probably not be that. that
Yes.
work, right? And, I think of, you touched upon this a little bit, that, what is a collection, right? I mean, I think of it as really a reflection of a journey,
Yes.
right? And that journey will have some highlights. It will have definitely some lowlights, although as we get better at spotting the highlights, we hide the lowlights, Those are the ones that never come out of storage, right?
In museums, it's called reserve collection.
Reserve collection, yes. And then, you kind of also get comfortable with the fact that, there are some objects that you would like to acquire for posterity of a certain kind.
Yeah.
It may not be in your collection. So we talked about size, right? Does it matter sometimes? But, we acquired, actually for this museum, a very large 3-cylinder Nalini Malani work. And, we're delighted that it is being exhibited somewhere, but there would never be an opportunity for us to show it, ever, unless we rent it out like a football field or something. So there is, there is that the art is not always for yourself. In some instances, it is to share. In some instances, it is, for you to just enjoy in your private moments.
So I want to pick up on that and ask also the other panelists this point about collecting is a journey. So you learn along the way, and sometimes tastes change, your sort of focus change. So I just want to throw the question open, like, since all of you have been collecting for quite a long period of time, what is it that helped you? Did you have advisors? Did you have people that you sort of went to see, or did you learn in any kind of formal way? What helped, or what was important in shaping, your eye and your taste, and how did that affect, how you started decades ago and how you are looking at collecting all the objects now?
I think it was Picasso who said something very profound, and I will misquote him, but he said, when I was an infant, I could paint like a genius, and then I learned about art, and it took me a lifetime to be able to achieve that innocence again. And Jane and I were blessed with ignorance, because all we did was look, because Hussein, all these names didn't mean anything, and so all it was our relationship with whatever it was that we were seeing. I think Jane never really lost that ability to just resonate with the work. I got lost in my consulting world a bit, where I actually felt that I had to get some knowledge. And that ran the risk of just sending you down, and not necessarily blind alleys, just down the routes that everybody else traveled.
Yeah, because you have these categories.
Because you have these categories. Yeah. And here's the reality of India, and probably of any great. India has got just such an enormous and immense stock of talented people, of history, of culture, of art. You go and look, it's got more World Heritage sites than almost any country in the world, and it has got less tourists than Disneyland. I mean, most people just don't know what's there. And the beauty of collecting anything to do with India is only about 5% of what's out there is known. The unknowns are enormous. So the thing that we are proudest of in our collection are the byways, not the highways, because that's the stuff that's exciting, because it's still to be discovered. And
could you give an example of that, of a byway?
Well, because we were talking about the size of works. I just talk about Bureshwar Sen. I don't know if people know, but they're the smallest works we have. I mean, they're about this big. And in a way, they've got their own magic, because the energy that comes through them, the sensitivity behind them, his ability to be able to convey the massiveness of the Himalayas
Yes.
in something that's not much bigger than a postage stamp is quite extraordinary. But there are many, many examples of the early Bengals, the Dutch Bengal works, that have yet to be, I think, fully appreciated. I mean, Sohan Kadri, for example, just going to the other end of the extreme, is a very, very fine and important artist who I think has yet to become really discovered.
Yeah.
So the excitement comes when you say, aha, right?
Yeah.
You've now found somebody else who has got everything that is you think of as being important in a great artist. They've got a great concept, they've got great technical ability, they have something to say. And, you know, that journey has only just begun in India.
And I think what you're saying is true of a lot of collecting across Asia. You know, certainly true of how Chinese art started being collected. That the reality is that in scenes that are emerging, like those in many parts of the Asia, the scholarship follows the collecting actually, because you know before the categories form, that's how. Work gets come out, and later the sort of realization, the discourse forms after that. You know, that's certainly true of China, you know, where a lot of the early, in the 80s, you know, a lot of the collectors, they were there because they were working on oil, on like gas or mining sort of investments, and they were pulling out these art that nobody had any description for because nobody's seen these things. There was no way to understand what they were. I think, you know, you're talking about something also quite similar in that sense, you know. So collecting is also from this kind of perspective, a kind of excavation of the culture of the time, you know, as it's a kind of cultural archaeology, you know. Can I ask?
Yeah, sure. Well, for me, first of all, I had an amazing person next to me, Marguerite, my wife. So we had a fantastic journey of picking up the works that we fell in love with. But in terms of people who have assisted, I have to give a lot of credit to Mr. Hussain himself, who was my mentor for many, many, many years, who personally traveled with me to introduce me to all of the progressives, most of the progressives at the time, and then going on a step-by-step process within Ram Kumar, meeting with Ram Kumar, explaining his works in detail, or meeting with Taib in person, Kishan Khanna, Akbar Padamsi. So in every step of the way, it's an education. It's a process and learning of what this particular artist is working on and why he's doing what he's doing. And then also learning the parallels between why a particular work was done. Well, because we met in Varanasi, we were together at the time. So yes, we painted this in 1971 because all of us experimenting together in Varanasi. So this kind of a learning was extremely important to me, to learn it directly from a mentor like Hussain. And on top of that, he used to tell me which are the works that I need to collect, which works of his works that I must collect. To give you an example, the bull, the cover of Harry Abelson's book. Hussain sat next to me in the auction house. He would not let me get up from my seat until I bought that work.
That's very rare.
Yeah. So, I was a bit spoiled in terms of the timing in that time period, because I just had him next to me for everything I want to do. If I want to arrive in Calcutta, he's in Calcutta with me. If I want to arrive in Bombay, in Hussain, he's with me without even asking, right? And he would get information from me. If I'm in Bangalore, he would get indirect information. He would arrive in Bangalore at my hotel where I'm staying. Like, Hussain, how did you know I was here? This is Mr. Hussain. I said, okay, fine, I'm not saying anything anymore. So this was the process, the way I learned from him and the way he helped me in collecting the works that I've collected. So that was my process.
So the sort of direct encounter with actual players in the field. Sunil?
So I can offer, if you're not as spoiled as Kent. So, if you don't have the luxury of having access to Mr. Hussain or some of the ones that have passed away. So really, I think you can also be spoiled because you live in New York, right? Because you have amazing institutions here, and you have something called, Amazon and bookstores. And so I think, it's really about calibration of your eyes and your mind and your heart. So you can calibrate that, and you can learn the best works because you have access to all these collections. So if you're not going to the Met or the Asian Society, in New York, and if you live in New York, it's a huge disservice because you have some of the most phenomenal Indian art that's on Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue. So I think if you don't have the luxury of having artists, you have the ability to access public institutions and the books, and you can I don't read, but I look at pictures. So you can you can calibrate that way,
yes.
And you can become spoiled in a different direction than Kent became spoiled.
I'm not spoiled like Ken.
Yes.
But I think if you're not going to museums, you have no excuse. You have to go to museums, right? You have to read. And for me, I have learned a lot from gallerists.
Yes.
My first mentors was Vadera from Vadera Art Gallery, and he actually told me, don't buy art for a year, just go around, look at art all over, and he connected me with some of the top collectors. He gave me stashes of books to read. He introduced me to curators. And I actually was allowed into these people's homes to see just remarkable works of art that you don't get to see without those introductions. That continues, to this day. I think many, many years ago in Deepak's gallery, I saw Nasreen, and by golly, has Nasreen ever stayed with me? So I think, there is that entire process. And then, you learn through that knowledge that you gain. You learn through the mistakes that you make. And I think there is that, composite. Over time, your eye does get a little bit better, Hopefully you make mistakes, but new ones. Not the same.
So time and effort.
Can I just build on something?
Yes.
There's this concept of 10,000 hours to
Yes.
get mastery in something. I think you also have to do 10,000 paintings and have 10,000 conversations.
Yeah.
And in India, one of the things that is most striking is the lack of institutional strength there. If you talk about the museums, you go to the NGMA, and it's sort of turns you off art more than turns you onto it. Unfortunately, it's very sad. So to really go and see it, you have to speak to the other collectors or some of the gallerists. And the great thing, certainly in the sort of mid to early 90s, was we all knew that we were slightly odd people, right? You bumped into somebody who actually collected and liked this stuff, and you sort of whisper it to each other, and then you find out actually you like Ganesh Pine, and then you end up in Prakashas, you end up in Chitrakoot drinking tea for 3 days, and and then this becomes this great journey, and you have your first 500 conversations, and that is also one of the great things about the Indian culture. It's just very warm and welcoming once they understand that you're actually interested in trying to find out more. So I think we got our most from fellow collectors and gallerists.
So to enter, I suppose, the network, the community of people around that art scene, I think seems to be a kind of very important stage, for serious sort of collecting, because as Dipti says, collecting is almost like a learning journey. It's a journey where you learn along the way, and that as much as it is a kind of solo journey, it's also a journey with a community. So with that, I think we have time for like 2 questions from the audience. Please, can we wait? Where's the mic? This is just so that those people on the internet can hear us. Yeah, the gentleman in front.
Yeah, I have a kind of curious question. All of you talk about a visceral reaction and then a journey after that. You also talk about having made mistakes, which everybody does. I'm just interested, what is your philosophy about selling your mistakes?
Are you interested in buying, Tina? Bye, I've got some deals for you.
We'll open this to the panel. I think Dipti,
Same here.
Yeah.
Let's talk. No. So actually, on a more serious note, I'd say that most of the artists I collect are contemporary. I mean, I'd say about 90% of our collection is contemporary art. And when you have living artists, you do need to treat that material with caution. We have been we're just coming out of a market where, because of speculative investments, the reputation of many artists was deeply affected. So I think the buy and dump kind of strategy is something that I'm not very good at selling in any case, but I think you have to be super careful when you have young artists or artists who are still practicing today.
Yeah. I mean, look, you're going to learn, and you have to. It's a constantly changing curation process, but So sometimes you will have to edit, and you'll have to sell. I'm also not very good at selling like Dipti. But yes, I have sold in the past, but we've bought, Blanca and I have bought more than we've sold, and it's a process. And in order to buy, I think the unwritten rule is it should be better than what you have already. And Blanca she's the more rational of the two of us. So she says, okay, well, what are you going to dispose of before you get this? So,
It's called
she's not always
upgrading.
Successful at that.
It's called upgrading.
I want to tell you the genesis of the question. I know an art collector who will remain unnamed, who said to me once, Tino, the act of buying the painting is an important memory in my life. I don't sell the memories of my life. I have never sold a piece of work that I've bought, even if I hate it today.
The lady at the back. Oh.
It's really very exciting to see all of you on a panel together. My question is, given the the prowess and the wealth of India and the diaspora and it's just an incredibly strong and wealthy and prosperous community. Why don't you think collecting has caught up with that paradigm, and that the number of collectors and the kind of collecting is still incredibly narrow, and it's contained to just a few people, and it's not at parity with the kind of position that India has, unlike the Chinese, who have really embraced their own culture and they're really sort of picking up pieces. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there's, I would presume to say, so few connoisseurs in our field?
Actually, I had this conversation with Arvind last week. For people sort of in my generation, we grew up in a very resource scarce time, and there was nothing extra. When I grew up, it was like, hey, you have to learn math, science, technology. That is how. I'm not speaking for all of you. I'm speaking for myself. And so there was no time to say. And I vividly remember my parents taking me to the museums in Baroda on a Sunday or Saturday, and so I think it's just in this generation that people in India and those of us who've left have the resources to actually acquire it. You could still appreciate it. So to answer your question, I think the next generation and the one beyond it will have the extra resources when there will be resource surplus, and we'll have the time surplus to devote to learn and to take an interest. But growing up, I didn't know any collectors.
Well, I think it's not about resource. I think Indian economy is doing very well, and people do have resources. I don't think it's nothing to do with the resources. I think it's just a matter of time. I think we went through this capsule of time in which collectors are very much passionate about collecting, they were able to come on early to collect. If you look at 99 or 2000, I mean, only people who were passionate about buying art, they bought the works for themselves because they're passionate about buying works. There were no investors coming in and picking up the works of art at the time. So I think it's just a matter of time. It's maturing. The market is maturing. It's steadily, it's coming along, but it's just taking a little bit longer time than other countries have taken. But I think if you wait maybe another few years, you will see this market doing much, much better, and you'll see a lot more collectors coming on board with the vengeance to collect the works of art. And that's my personal opinion.
Okay, one last question, and we need to move on.
Name is Dr. Lalita Mason, and I have discovered that I should own some Indian art very late in life, and I started reading books and fascinated me, and I said, how did I lose up all this time? I grew up in Hyderabad, a very princely state, very rich in culture, and my father was a palace physician, surrounded with art and antiquities, you name it, but the spark never happened, you know. I don't know why it happened. Probably the Indian schools and colleges, and they are not inculcating us with, you know, growing up with art, and I feel so left behind because I've lost time, but I'm moving forward. One good question to all the collectors here. I started doing some research, and I found this artist, and a friend of mine who's a hotelier, she told me, oh, auntie, I just commissioned a painting from so-and-so. Is that a good thing to start? Because my budget is very low, you know. Commission to do an artwork with an upcoming artist.
Since obviously it's referring to a contemporary artist, we're all looking at you.
You know, I think it would perhaps depend on the artist and depend on what they were willing to do for you. You know, I personally feel that the journey, especially, and I understand what you're saying. I have never had even a liberal arts course in my entire life, leave alone a fine arts course. So I came to the art world completely uneducated, and even now I am only marginally educated, right? So I think it's a really, really rough journey, and having a guide is very useful. I would actually, rather than a friend, you know, perhaps go to a few galleries. You know, if you pick galleries wisely, you will receive, I think, some useful guidance. The other thing is, now is a fantastic time because the auction houses have sales up. So you should go to Sotheby's, you should go to Christie's, see some of the work they have. There's sort of a historical perspective also that you get, although not so much contemporary material, but a little bit, yes. So I'd say that might be the way to do it.
My only comment on that is that, at least for us when we buy, it's the emotional reaction to the specific work. And you can see, we were at a couple of galleries today, and they have the same artists and with the same work, and some works you say, those are fantastic, those are, I would love to have that. Another one just doesn't hit that mark. So when you have a commission, the two things that I struggle with that, I think that an artist has to find a way of expressing themselves, and trying to force them too much to do something for a particular space. Sometimes that can be a source of inspiration. I sometimes worry about the fact that it's then being done for reasons of money rather than for, I think, pure reasons. But I think the biggest one is you just don't know how it's going to turn out, and you just don't know whether it's going to be... It may be good, but it just may not speak to you.
Yeah.
Well, I think...
and then you'll be stuck with it, right? Because...
the Mitchells have commissioned him to do certain artwork, so that kind of, you know...
Well, as a fellow Hyderabadi, you know, I concur, or if not, I'll at least support you on a few things. Number one is artwork is very personal to you. It doesn't matter what we all tell you, what the advice is, right? If you really like the work of art, you get it. It's yours. You're going to live with it, not your friend, not a curator from a museum. No, it's up to you. It's your personal connection with the artist. Yes, I have commissioned Hussein to do a number of works for me. You know, without going into details, I can tell you, yes, he has done works, and I'm happy. But again, it all depends on you and your relationship with the artist. Whether it's a mistake or not, you have to learn it. That's your journey. We've all made mistakes. Not one, two. We've done many, many, many mistakes in our lives, right? It's like going to a university, taking a class. You only want to take the finance class, but no, they want you to take every other class with it. But they're all useless to you because you're only passionate about that one class. Same thing here in the process. You need to learn yourself, your journey, on how you want to get to the point as a passionate collector.
Thank you, Ken. And now, I'm sure you have many questions. We can continue with discussing that in the reception that follows. But we want to come now to the book launch portion of the evening. And of course, tonight, out there later, you will see the book Modern Indian Painting, the Jane and Kito de Boer collection, which is edited by Rob Dean and Gilles Tillotson. The book presents a survey of Indian painting from the late 19th century to the present day, drawn, of course, from the collection of Jane and Kito de Boer. And at this moment, I would like to invite Kito to say a few words about the journey that led to this publication.
The highlight of the evening.
That's why
there it is.
End.
There it is. 10 years in the making.
Is it really 10 years?
It is. It's actually more than 10 years. I'll talk a bit about that journey. First of all, it's the Jane and Kito de Boer collection. So Jane is there. She... I'll use the analogy that my daughter's also sitting behind her, Claire, and she's a chef. When I go into a restaurant, I say, oh, I like this meal, and she will say, well, she'll then deconstruct the meal in her head and tell you why I like it. It's exactly the same with Jane. She's an interior designer. I just go to a painting and say, oh, I like that painting, and she will understand why I like it or don't like it. And so this is very much our joint collection. It's just that I happen to be standing up here talking. The other thing is, I want to point out, it's published by Mappin, and I would all encourage you to have a selfie with Bipin, who's at the back. Bipin is the pin in Mappin, and the reason I think you should all have a selfie with him is because he's an endangered species. Because he actually publishes really, really good books. And when I started on this journey with him, I said, look, if we did this, what would a good sale be? And he said, well, one as a start. And I said, well, but seriously, I mean, how many books like this, do they typically sell? If it's 2,000, it's really good. He said, well, how many do you have to sell to make money? Oh, 15,000. So this is definitely, I spoke to our kids a little while ago, about 10, 15 years ago, that I like music, and we were listening to LPs, and they said, what are LPs? It will be like that, I think, for your grandchildren. They'll ask, what are books? But Bipin does this because he loves books and publication. He's done a fantastic job of that. And also, Giles isn't here. He said that much as he loved working on it, he was a father when he started being the editor, and his children had since graduated from university, and he was now a grandfather, and he had had enough of it.
So it took a long time.
So it took a long time, and Rob here has been with the collection for more than 25 years and knows everything intimately. So thank you all to all the help, and DK, thank you for helping catalyze this as well. So what is the book about? Very quickly, it is about modern Indian art, really not modern Indian painting. I would have called it, I think we were initially going to call it the art of history, and it became modern Indian painting because the file that we were editing was called MIP, M-I-P. And despite all these years of editing and having had it proofread, the one thing we didn't do was think about what the file cover meant and what the book cover was. So it just became automatically modern Indian painting because that was what the file name was, and we never caught that. It is about art mainly in the 20th century. It starts in about 1880 through to 2000. It goes through into about 2010, but it really looks at the 20th century. There are three broad sections to it. There's a section with Jane and me talking about our journey and why we collected and how we collected. There is a core part of it, which is in 4 chapters, where we commissioned 4 different writers to write in different periods. So Giles Tillotson talked about the very early Bengal period. Partha Mitra wrote about the Bengal school. Sona Datta wrote about the late Bengal, and Yashodhara wrote about the progressives. So I think there are chapters of academic writing. And then we have 4 deep dives into 4 artists where we have interviews with the ones who are still alive. We have a deep dive on Chitta Prasad, on Ramachandran, on Rameshwar Bruta, and Ganesh Pine. And Sona Datta, who's Bengali, did the Ganesh Pine interview. Anybody who knew him, he was a person who, when his wife was around, was not likely to speak very much. So it took a while to prize him away from her, but then he gave one of the last interviews in his life, and it's a very revealing conversation. So that's really what the book is about. Why did it take 10 years? And why did it started off actually with Rob, where we'd been having discussions. And he said, well, why don't you just get the damn stuff photographed? Because part of Rob's job was to go through the attic and through the basements, digging all these things out and trying to catalogue them. And he thought it would be a good wheeze to have some pictures of them. So we hired Justin Piperger, who does art photography in London, does a lot of work for the Saatchis, and that was more than 10 years ago, and he came and spent a week and did all the photography. And that's why, and then we commissioned the writers.
Writing.
The reason it took a long time was we actually didn't know what the purpose was of writing a book. I mean, what had really happened is that in Dubai we would have these paintings on the wall and people would come along and nobody really knew anything about Indian art. I mean, there would be a few who would know what a Hussein was, but beyond that, and they would be polite, they'd understand that art was interesting to us, and they'd come along and they'd say, ooh, what's that? And I'd say, oh, it's a Chandra Waldekar.
Yeah.
And then there would be an awkward silence because what do you do with that?
Yes.
So they then think of something. They say, well, why don't you write a book? Which really meant, let's go and have a gin and tonic. So you had a lot of those types of conversations. But then after a while, some, I think, more serious people said, look, there is something that you should do because you have quite a significant collection. And you should really do a book because you cover the entire 20th century. But it still was very, I mean, what on earth, if you're going to charge $65, what is somebody going to get out of this book? Why, what ultimately is the reason we're going to ask people to look through 250 pages? There has to be a purpose behind it. And I think in the end, what we decided to write, I think of it actually, it's a love story. It's not really about collection, it's about the fact that we wanted to engage with the culture deeply and with the people deeply, and this was a good way to do that. And it shone a torch, I think, on 100 years of collecting. And when people saw our collection, so many people said, aha, now we've begun to see stuff that we had not seen before. We're now beginning to understand things about our own culture that we didn't understand before. And so some things are quite simple. We have lots of work from Bengal. And people say, well, why do you have all this Bengal stuff? I said, well, if you're collecting European art, why do you have stuff from Florence? Right? It's because that's where, in Europe, a lot of culture started. And some things are just so simple once you start to collect. You realize that Calcutta was the 5th largest city in 1900 on the planet. It was the jewel and the jewel of the crown. It was really the heart of the British Empire. All you have to do is now go to the Red Fort in Delhi and see the complete Daniels print collection, which is, I think, for the first time and you'll really be able to see Indian history at that time. And that's why there's so much art from Bengal. And then you start to say, well, New Delhi, of course, didn't exist. And Bombay was little more than a fishing port. So really, Bengal in the pre-war period was basically everything. And then you start to, that's the first thing you understand. And when you start to collect Bengali work, you start to see that there are all these different schools, and why do they have these different schools? And what did it mean to be an Indian artist in a colonial India in 1900? And you could either face West and become a Western academic teacher, like artists like Raj Ravi Verma. Oil painting wasn't a natural medium for Indians. Or you could be like the Tagores, who wanted to push against being facing West, and they faced east towards Japan, and there was strong links with Japan and Buddhism, and they started the whole medium, or they worked with the medium of watercolors, and they painted with a very strong Asian and Japanese aesthetic. Or you could say, we don't want to look east, or we don't want to look west, we want to look down into our own culture and draw from that. And you start to go into the different schools, you begin to understand what does it actually mean to be a sensitive, intelligent human being, which most of these great artists were in that time, and what choices and decisions you have to make. Because one of the mysteries of art is, for 50,000 years, somebody has stood in front of a blank something, whether it's a wall or a piece of stone or a canvas or a piece of plastic, and then they do something. Why on earth do they do what they do? And you learn as you start to collect that you move from asking the question who or what, so who painted it or what was it they painting, to the most important question of all is why. Why did that person at that time do what they did? And if you begin to unravel that question of why, you discover a lot about the culture that you're in. So I think this book, I hope for those people who are interested, there aren't many books in India to begin with. That's unfortunate. I think the whole institutional basis of
the
learning
distribution
is very weak. If you've shown it to people, it's a bit like showing them to our collection. They all immediately turn to the Souzas or to the Gaitondes, or because it's greatest hits. And it's a bit like putting on Now 1976. I don't know if you have those CDs. You know, every year there's a Now 1976, and it's the greatest hits from 1976. And it's fun, right? If you're driving a car and you've got really nothing else to do, put it on, because it makes you feel warm and comfortable inside. But you don't learn anything from it, right? There's not a quest of a journey or any excitement. And what we hope people will get out of this book is to actually stop and look at the stuff that you don't know. And you might want to have the instinct of turning the page over, because actually I think a lot of these works have got an important story to tell. And we hope that in looking through this and reading through this, not only will you go down some journeys less traveled, which are also very beautiful, you'll also learn more about India.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, we invite everybody to the books are at the back, and we have signed copies that are available. I had a brief glance of it when I saw it in Delhi, and I think it's interesting. It also goes back to what Kito said right at the beginning of the section, like that looking through it, you also get the sense that collecting, if done in a certain way, a certain kind of determined and consistent way, is also a kind of way of mapping a particular culture, getting a sense of it's a way of learning, of discovering the sort of richness of that culture, not the it in its usual categories, but also these, the word byways came about. And I think these are part of that kind of aha moment that many collectors speak about, that suddenly there is a kind of epiphany, a moment of revelation. So I would just like to end by thanking Kito and all our panelists for spending their time with us, and all of you for coming during a busy Asia week. Please go and look at the books behind. They're available tonight. So we have our shop representative. And please have a drink before you run off to your next event. Thank you.